What's up, everybody? I'm Matt Gary, and in this episode of Coding with the Force, we're going to go over how and when to use the different types of asynchronous processes in Apex. All right, everybody. So today we are going to be going over Asynchronous Apex in Salesforce. We're going to go over what it is, why it's important, and then we're going to go over examples of the 4 primary types of asynchronous Apex that you will be using, which is Queueable, Scheduled Apex, Batch Apex, and Future methods. And we're also going to talk about 3 other types of asynchronous Apex that you can use, which are platform events, push topics, and change events. We won't be doing examples on them because then this video would be like 3 hours long. But we will go over, when you should consider using those last 3. And if you guys are interested, I'll create videos on those topics as well. In fact, I already have one on change data capture right over here. It's called How to Use Asynchronous Change Event Triggers in Salesforce. So if you're interested in that, definitely go check it out. Now, before we get into this video, make sure if you enjoy it to actually hit the like button, because that helps me get this video out to more people who might be interested in learning this stuff for free, just like you. And if you really, really like the video, make sure to subscribe and share the video, because if you didn't know, every single person that subscribes and also shares a video, each month you get entered into a drawing that gets you a free Salesforce certificate of your choice, as in you have to go take it. I don't generate a certificate. You've got to go take the cert, but I'm going to fund it for you for free. And you get 1 hour of consulting time with me to ask me any questions you'd like about your Salesforce org or whatever else. And on top of that, you'll get 1 month in a Discord server where you can ask me questions every day as soon as you think about them, as long as they're related to Salesforce. So with that said, let's get into asynchronous Apex and when you would use each one of these different types in your Salesforce org. So the first thing that we should probably talk about is, what is asynchronous Apex? You might be looking at the word asynchronous and thinking, I have no idea what this means, and that's fine. We're going to cover it. So what is asynchronous Apex? Basically, what it is a way for you to run code, but non-synchronously. And so what does that mean? To run code in a non-synchronous fashion, right? Again, maybe a confusing word. If I came over here and I created a new Apex class, and, we'll call this class Synchronous Apex, and and we created a method in here. We'll just call it a public void sync method, not that. Then if we started writing some code, say we're gonna create a variable and we'll just call it I don't know, I'll say string taco equals taco, and then maybe we wanted to manipulate this string or capitalize it or something, then we could do that, right? And this is all happening synchronously, right? So if you called this class and you ran this method, then this line would happen before this line happens, right? So it's an order in which your code operates, and it's expected to operate. So if I called synchronous Apex and then called this sync method, you would expect that this line, the one that creates taco, the variable taco here, would run before this line, right? And that's called a synchronous transaction, right? This line goes, and then this line goes, and then anything underneath it goes, and blah, 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 blah. But what happens if you don't want it to be synchronous, as in it's not actually beneficial to you? Maybe you're hitting Salesforce limits, maybe you're having to process a large amount of data, I don't know, and you want to speed up that data processing because, processing 1 million records one by one by one by one by one takes a long time. But if you could take 10 records and process it here at the same time you're processing this one, then you can process a lot more records all at the same time. And that's what asynchronous is. It's like if you wanted to process this line and this line at the exact same moment in time instead of this line first and then this line second, right? I should probably zoom in a little. But that's what we're talking about when we talk about asynchronous. We're saying, you know, why don't we run this line and this line at the exact same moment in time instead of this line, you know, a millisecond before this one does, right? So when we talk about asynchronous, we're talking about spawning processes or running code that run at the same moment in time, or you know, there's no way you can guarantee. I just want to be clear that they run at the same moment in time, but they start running in parallel to each other, right? So you're starting to process multiple things at the same moment in time instead of having them wait in line for one to be done and then the next to be done and blah, 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 right? And you will, if that's still confusing, that's okay. When we go over the examples, it'll start to be really clear what I mean by asynchronous Apex and how it's really beneficial to you. So that's kind of a general overview of what asynchronous Apex is and what synchronous Apex is, which is what you normally write about 90% of the time, typically. Maybe a little less than that, maybe a little more, I don't know. But there you go. Now, as far as why you would want to use asynchronous Apex, we kind of went over that in what asynchronous Apex is. But say you are running some code, right? And that code is really complicated for one reason or another, right? I don't know why that might be. You might know better than me. And you're running into Salesforce limits, right? And in asynchronous Apex, if you didn't know, your limits get heightened quite a bit. So you can push things out to asynchronous Apex classes or methods and really increase the amount that you can do with your code, because you start to increase your limits. You're not trying to do everything in sync, right? You've got two different jobs now running, doing their different things with different limits. And, you can get a lot more complex with your code if you need to. That's the key there, if you need to. And some people do this and they don't need to do it. But if you need to, then you can start using asynchronous Apex. Another one that we kind of discussed previously is batch Apex, or I don't think we said the word batch, but you have a lot of data that you need to manipulate for one reason or another. Maybe you need to update a bunch of data every night, or maybe you need to send that data somewhere every night. I don't know what it might be, but you can use batch Apex to start processing that data, that large data volume, in an asynchronous manner that'll allow you to do those things quicker and not be subjected to the many limits that you get into with synchronous Salesforce or synchronous Apex, regular Apex that you're typically writing in your triggers and your controllers or your service classes or whatever they might be. All right. So, two major things. Asynchronous Apex is good for processing very complex Apex. It's also good for processing, large amounts of data. And the last thing is that it's necessary at times if you are making callouts to external services, right? Sometimes those callouts to external services, integrations with other systems, can be very long running. You can't actually make those, say, from a trigger. So if your trigger aggregated records that needed to be sent to another system, you couldn't actually do that from your trigger, you'd have to call an asynchronous job to get that done. So that's one of the other things that you see Asynchronous Apex used for pretty frequently. Now, let's talk about the asynchronous options that you're going to use most commonly in Salesforce and when you should use those options, right? So the things that, the asynchronous options that you're going to be utilizing most frequently in Salesforce, these are not the only ones, but these are the ones that you're going to use the vast majority of the time, are Queueable Apex, Scheduled Apex, Batch Apex, and Future methods. And it is important to know when you should use each of these types, right? When would you use Queueable Apex over Scheduled or Batch or Future? And, you know, that might not be easy, especially if this is the first time you're even looking into asynchronous processing in general, right? So as far as when you should use Queueable Apex or Future methods, you would use those two options if you wanted something to finish relatively soon, right? There's no guarantee as to when asynchronous jobs will finish, but say you were running some code in a service class or a trigger handler or whatever else, and you wanted to spawn an asynchronous job, run some asynchronous Apex, and you wanted that asynchronous Apex to hopefully finish, you know, in the next minute or two, right? Ideally. And then you would probably want to use either Queueable or Future. Typically, you don't use Batch or Schedule for either of those. That would be not a great idea. So if you want something to finish relatively soon that is asynchronous in processing, then you would use Queueable Apex or Future methods. Now, when should you use Queueable over Future is the next question. And I would say you should pretty much always use Queueable over Future, in my personal opinion. And I say that because Future methods were really one of the first things, if not the first thing, I'm not really sure to be honest, that Salesforce provided to developers for asynchronous processing. And while it's great and it's simple, it's not as good and as capable as Queueable Apex is. In Queueable Apex, you can pass complex types, as in if I wanted to pass a whole contact record to a Queueable Apex class, then I could. But with Future methods, I can't. You can only pass strings or IDs or other primitive types, right? I could pass integers, whatever else, right? But I can't pass a complex type to a Future method. Typically, the only place that I see this used is for callouts to external web services, and if I'm being completely honest, I wouldn't even use it there these days. So in my personal opinion, somebody out there might have a different one, and they might have a good reason for their thinking, and I'd love to hear it. But in my personal opinion, I wouldn't ever use Future methods these days. They're kind of like the predecessor of the Queueable Apex option, and it's quite a bit better in my opinion. So then, when should you use Scheduled Apex or Batch Apex? The answer to that is if you want something to process, outside of your normal synchronous transaction, and you don't care that it finishes anytime soon, then Scheduled Apex and Batch Apex are the way to go. Typically, you'll use Scheduled Apex to run something like it says here on a specific schedule. So if you wanted something to run every hour or once a day or once a week, then you'd go with the Scheduled Apex route. If you wanted something to, run right now, but you expected it to need to operate on a large volume of data and it could take quite a bit of time to deal with, then you'd go with the Batch Apex route. Typically, I use Batch Apex when I know I'm going to have to make updates to, 30, 50, 100,000 records for one reason or another. And this allows me to vastly increase if you use query locators, which we'll talk about eventually as well, the amount of data that you can query for and the amount of data that you can, manipulate. So, yeah, that is a breakdown of why you should use each one of these different asynchronous options that you have available to you. Let's go into actually creating some Queueable Apex, future methods, scheduled Apex, and batch Apex together, so we can figure out how to actually build these out and execute them in, a real world scenario. All right, maybe not real world, but we're going to figure out how to actually at least build this stuff together, right? So first things first, let's go over how to do queuables, because they're my favorite, and I hope that they'll be yours too. Anyway, so let's pop up IntelliJ or whatever IDE it is that you want to use. Visual Studio Code, Welkins, who knows? There's so many options. Not really, but there's a handful. And if you have no idea what an IDE is or how to set it up and use it in your Salesforce org, don't worry. I got a whole bunch of videos for you to watch. Okay, it's not that many, 1 or 2. They take about 20 minutes of your time, and they will change your life and make it so much easier as a developer. So I'll pop something up here and put something in the description, and you can check that out. Save yourself from the developer console. Anyway, let's get to it. So first things first, let's build a queuable class and figure out how queuables actually work, right? All right, so first things first, let's go to our Apex classes and create a new Apex class. Now, if you're in Visual Studio Code, you would hit Control-Shift-P, I believe, to pop up the command palette and type in Apex class and create a new Apex class that way. That's the only real difference between what I'm showing you here today. And, yeah, nothing else will really change for you. So, especially if you follow those guides that I have to set up the 2 IDEs. Very similar, other than creating classes. All right, so we'll call this Queueable example. Hopefully I spelled that right. Queueable. Yep, that looks maybe right. And the first thing that we're going to do here is zoom in. But then we're going to say implements Queueable, like that. And right now it's complaining because I'm implementing the Queueable interface. If you don't know what an interface is, no big deal. You don't technically need to know about it at all to get your, what we're going to do here done. But if you're interested in what interfaces are, I got a video for that one too. And it'll teach you why it's complaining here and why it's expecting us to implement a method in our class before we can save it. So right now it's complaining must implement the following methods or be declared abstract. And we can implement those methods by clicking this button here if you're using IntelliJ and Illuminated Cloud 2. You can't, I don't think, if you're using Visual Studio Code, but it's been a while since I've been there. So I'm going to implement those methods and hit OK. And as far as what we do next, we'll just make something up as we go here. So we've implemented for this class called Queueable example, the Queueable interface, and the Queueable interface expects us to at least have this execute method within our Apex class, right? So we need this execute method to be able to abide by this Queueable interface and actually start writing some code and getting things done. Now, the next thing that you might be wondering is how do we actually pass data into this Queueable class, right? So we got this class and it only has this one method, this execute method, which is the method when you call your Queueable class that will basically immediately be executed. And we'll see that this is, the way that we call this is a little different than what you're probably used to. But the way that we get that done is by using what's called a constructor. So if you don't know what a constructor is, basically when you construct your class or make a new instance of your class, you want to pass some data to it to give it what it needs to actually do its job right? So in our case, we're going to create a constructor, which is basically a method that returns nothing, that is the same name as your class always. And we're going to pass it some data. So maybe we want to pass it, I'm just going to keep it simple and pass it a contact. And we will create a contact variable, say public contact passed equals, we'll just leave it like that. And then we'll down here say cont passed equals cont, like that. So we've got our contact all filled out because we've passed it in our constructor, and then we can use it down here in our execute method like we'll see here in just a second. So down here in our execute method, because we've used a constructor and we've passed in our contact and assigned it to a class level variable, all things, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, are good reasons to go check out the Apex masterclass that I'm putting together. There's a whole playlist for it. I'm creating more videos every single week, so with time, all this stuff will be covered. I believe this week is when we cover constructors, but I might be wrong. So this video over constructors will be up soon, if it's not by the time this video is released. So, all right. So we've got our contact, and we've assigned it to our class level contact pass variable, and maybe down here in the execute method, to keep things real simple for us so that we can just figure out how all this stuff works, we're going to change some attributes of the contact. So we'll say contact cont passed dot last name equals chocolate, and cont passed dot first name equals Queueable. And then we're just going to update our contact that's passed. And now normally you'd want to do a bunch of other things like error checking and whatever else. But I'm going to just assume that you guys know the many good things you should do, because I'm just trying to show you how Asynchronous Apex works in this video. So one other thing that you can do, and that we'll set up before we actually call this class and start executing it, are relatively new. They're called transaction finalizers, and it's awesome because basically now you can know when your queueable is finished, and you can, log that it's finished. You can send out an email that it's finished. You can let people know if there's something that's gone wrong with your queueable transaction. So it's great, especially for logging things, because again, all this stuff is asynchronous. You don't really know for sure that it's completed all the time, right? And it's good to kind of log those things and whatnot. So if you want to start using Finalizer, then you would also implement Finalizer. So you've got Queueable and Finalizer, and now it's going to complain again because I'm implementing a new interface and I'm not implementing the methods that that interface wants me to implement. So I'm going to implement the method again, and you can see it's giving me this Finalizer context. And there's a lot of things that you can do with this. I can't remember if I have an error log in my org. We'll go see here in a minute. And if I do, I'll log an error here. But basically what you can do in these transaction finalizers here is you can, like I said before, send out an email to yourself letting you know that it's been done.Maybe you might be doing this a lot, so that might not be the best idea. Or you could log this information in, say, a transaction logging table or error logging tables if you only care about the errors. All that kind of stuff. So finalizers are great for getting that done. They're relatively new. I think they're only maybe a year old, maybe not even that long. And they're wonderful for logging, your queueable information, right? There's a lot that you can get out of the finalizer context param1 here. Okay, so for instance, like if I wanted to say get the, let's see, param1 dot, you can get the job ID of the queuable that was executing, get any exceptions that it had, get the result. The result tells you whether it was a success or a failure, and it's just great to have. So I just want to make you aware of that. I might log some errors here if I have an error logging thing in my org, which I think I do, but I don't remember what it's called. So we'll get there when we get there. So we've got our queuable set up, and I'm going to just save this. And I'm going to do a couple things. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the synchronous Apex that we created together right at the beginning of this video to kind of figure out what asynchronous means. And we're going to do a couple things. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get a list of contacts, list, and I'm really just going to care about the first one that I get. So we'll say select ID, first name, last name, from contact, limit 1. And then I'm going to do an update to the contact here. And then I'm going to send it out to the queuable and see, that it makes an update. I'm also going to add email in here just so we have something to update in the synchronous method. So in the synchronous method, I'm going to take cont list 0 dot email and set it equal to synchronous at hotmail.com. And then I'm going to call out to my queuable to actually do the rest of it, right? So I'm going to update my email here. Then I'm going to call my queuable system.enqueueJob. This is how you call your queuables. But I should actually initialize my queuable first. So I'll say queuable example, example maybe equals new queuable example. And it's going to have this red line here because if you remember, we made a constructor where we need to pass a contact. So let's actually pass a contact. And we'll say cont list 0, which is the first element in our contact list. And then we're going to pass queueExample into that enqueueJob, which is going to allow us to, in our code, spawn a separate context that allows us to have asynchronous transactions running. So this enqueueJob will start running before this sync method is even finished. It will finish most likely at a later time, but it will start running before this one even ends. And then we will just make sure to update our cont list, right? And if I'm really unlucky, we'll get into a situation that you might find yourself in when you're using Asynchronous Apex that I should go over. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But let's see this code run. I should actually probably log into my Salesforce org. So let me log in over here and then pull up a contact, and I'll actually just query for a specific contact so I know which one I'm working with. All right, so we're going to go over to Sales Cloud, wherever you are, or my Sales app. Not really Sales Cloud. I mean, I guess it is, but that's not, you know what, I'm getting off topic. And we'll get Panther Danger here, which has got a whole bunch of custom junk on it. And you shouldn't ever do this, and I say this in all my videos, and I'm just going to keep saying it, even though I'm doing it. Do not ever use an ID in your code like I'm doing right here. But again, I'm trying to keep things simple and easy, and show you how things are done as opposed to making them a little difficult. So don't use IDs in your code, please. Ever, never, don't do it, please. All right, so we know that we're going to be updating this contact, and we know right now this contact's name is Panther Danger. I don't even know if it has an email. It doesn't have an email. And we also know that this synchronous class or code updates the email, and the queueable then will eventually update the first name and the last name, right? So let's save this code if I haven't. I think I actually already did. And I'm going to pull up Asynchronous Apex. There is a different way to do this in Visual Studio Code too, which I do believe I go over in the Visual Studio Code video. But yeah. So in here, in IntelliJ Illuminated Cloud 2, you can just click on this Asynchronous Apex tab down here, and you can go, and we're going to create a new instance of Synchronous Apex. Sync Apex equals new Synchronous Apex, and then we'll say sync apex dot sync method, and I'm going to execute this code, and we're going to watch as things happen over here. But before we actually run this code, I want to put a couple debug logs in here because I'm pretty positive that this is going to run so fast, unfortunately, that I'm not going to be able to refresh the page fast enough to show you that one finished after the other. So let's check it out. So in here, I'm going to add a system debug that says this is the contact in sync method. And then we will just put the cont list 0 there, right? And then we're going to put a debug in the actual queueable down here, and say this is the contact in the async method, and put contact passed in here so that we can see that this async method doesn't actually get the updates that this queueable has, right? The queueable is probably going to finish like ultra quick, but because it's such a simple thing that we're doing, but it's probably not, it's not going to be slow enough for me to refresh the page over here, you know, before it finishes. So let's now just press play on this, and we've seen it has run, and I've opened up the developer console over here, and we see that two things happened, right? So we've got this API, which is the actual Apex Anonymous that ran, and then the queueable that ran when the Apex Anonymous, or when the class that it called invoked it. So we can see, right, that right now the contact in this sync method, its last name is job, because I failed several times, and then I went back and I named its name job. So I think I showed you earlier its name was something ridiculous, but now its last name is job, and its email's been updated to synchronous at Hotmail. But you can see that its first and last name were not updated yet, right? So this is after we called the queueable, and still the first and last name have not been updated in this context, right? Now if we go over to the queueable, we can see that we did get the email sent over to it correctly, and we have now updated the first name and the last name, but that didn't, you know, happen before this code here was finished executing. The queueable happened just slightly later, you know, like a millisecond later. And if we go back to that contact that we were on, you can now see that its name is Queueable Chocolate, and it has the email synchronous@hotmail.com. So, all right, queueables, I think, are covered for the most part. Again, there's a little bit more to cover with finalizers. And the other thing that you can do with queueables, which is great, is you can chain queuables together. So if you want multiple queuables to kind of call each other, then you can do that. So say I wanted to call another queuable from this queuable in the execute, I can do that. But you do need to be careful that you don't accidentally get into a recursive thing where you call one queuable after another and another and another, and you go in a loop, because you can hit limits that, trust me, you don't want to hit. So queuables can be chained together, which is pretty unique thing. You can basically, I believe, stack them to basically an infinite depth, but you can only have 50 that are active at one time. So yeah, that is one thing you can do. You can actually do, system.enqueueJob here, and if I wanted to, I could literally invoke this queuable over again if I had a need to. So you can kind of create these unique recursive processes, or you can say this needs to update the contact here, and then I need another queuable that updates it somewhere else, or updates something else, maybe a related record to the contact, or who knows. So cool. Queuables, how to use them, the different things you can do with them. I think we're good here. Actually, one more thing we should cover. If you're wanting to use callouts in your queuable, which is a relatively frequent thing, I would say, you're going to get confused. You're probably going to write your integration, and then you'll be like, well, that's throwing all these weird errors. It's not letting me actually do the callout. You have to implement yet one more thing called database.allows callouts. And then you'll be good. At this point, you can call out to external systems. But if you don't implement database.allows callouts, you will have trouble. And yeah, you'll be in a little bit of a difficult situation. So make sure to implement that if you plan to call out to an external system. One more thing before we move on to future statements. This is just an example, and to be quite honest, this is not a real world scenario, right? You really shouldn't just use a queuable to update the first and last name of a contact. You should use it to process something that shouldn't or couldn't be processed in Synchronous Apex, right? For all the reasons that we discussed previously. I just wanted to call that out because this is kind of ridiculous, and if you ever used a queuable just to update the first and last name of a single contact in an org, that would be, well, it would quite frankly be pretty silly. So this is just for demonstration purposes. All right, let's move on to future methods, right? Say I was over here in the Synchronous Apex class, and for some reason I wanted to have a method that could operate asynchronously, right? What I would do is make a new method, of course, like we just talked about, and we'll say public static, we'll just say void for now, future method, and we need to make this, we need to use a tag or an annotation, the future annotation right here. And you might be wondering, why did I make this static? Well, anything that has a future tag or annotation needs to be static. Otherwise, it'll complain and tell you, why is your method not static? Not going to work for you, bro. Blah, blah, blah. So now I've got this method that is a future method, which means that if I call this method, it won't operate in the same context as, say, this one here. So let's just demonstrate that. Why don't I grab the same stuff that I did with the queuable here, and I'm just going to drop it over here in my future method, and we'll see a few shortcomings real quick. The first is that if I went over here and I tried to pass in contact, cont passed, just like before, it might not complain right now, but if I save this, it's going to complain. It's going to say, hey, my guy, you can't actually pass in a complex data type, right? And it's complaining right? It's saying future methods do not support parameters of type contact. Cool. So what does that mean? That means that if I want to use this and query for that contact and do the same things, that I actually have to pass in an ID, and I'll have to pass in my contact ID. And then in here, I'll have to say list of contact, cont list equals, we'll select ID, first name, last name, from contact where ID equals, whoa, not that. Contact ID. I'm not sure why I copy pasted there. My brain just left me for a second. So now we've got our contact list, and we can change our variable. But as you can see, now I've got a query yet again for that contact, which is less than ideal. And you're only allowed to pass primitive data types. Now you can pass, say, like a set of primitives, but you do have to, pass a primitive data type to that list or set. Okay, so let's see. We could even, just to demonstrate that, you could say a set of IDs, save it, and it saves fine, right? And if I just saved it with IDs, it'll also save fine, or with just an ID. Now, we'll do the exact same thing, so I'm just going to comment this out, this job in queuing, and I'm going to instead call synchronous apex dot future method and pass in my cont list 0 dot ID. Just like that, right? And now, if I call this code again, it's going to update things. But I'm going to change this to future, and I'm going to change this to asynchronous future try, and save it all. And then we're going to do the same thing we did before. I'm going to run this, and then we're going to review the debug log. So we'll run this anonymous Apex, and it ran, and you can see two things happened. One, we got the API, just like before, which is the anonymous Apex, and then we got this future handler instead of Queueable, which is our future method. So you can see that we had the old last name, Queueable chocolate, and we did update the email in the synchronous future try in the original method, but we haven't updated the last name to what we want it to be, first or last name to what we want it to be. So let's take a look at the future handler, and in here we've changed the first name to future and last name to chocolate. So you can see that those happen at different times. Despite being in the same class, they happen in different times. And if I bring up maybe my org, we can refresh our little guy here and see that things have happened. Future chocolate, synchronous future try, all good. So you can kind of see here, right, that there's some shortcomings of future because of that primitive setup. But, if you're looking for something a little bit simpler than a Queueable, you could certainly go that route if you wanted, but it's not my thing. And also, if you wanted to allow callouts to external databases, you would say callout equals true here. If you don't do that in your future method, then if you try to do a callout to an external system, it's going to complain. You're going to be sad and potentially waste a bunch of time Googling it. So there you go. All right. So we've handled the two kind of near-term things. Now there is one thing that I want to talk about real quick before we get into schedule and batchable, because this is important, especially for schedule and batchable jobs. Especially. There's this thing called record locking, which is something that I thought maybe would happen because I'm working on the same contact here and I'm updating it here as well as in the future method and in the Queueable. And when you're updating something, at the exact same time as another process, what happens is process 1, the one that started updating or working with that record first, has locked it, right? And this is common. This isn't just a Salesforce thing. This is just a database thing in general. Somebody's working on that record. They're updating it. They're messing with it, whatever. They're going to lock that record for that brief moment in time so that it can do its job and work on it. And then it's going to open it up again, and then something else can come in later to do whatever updates they need. Now, if you have this synchronous process working on the record at the same time an asynchronous process is working on the record, like this queueable, then what you can get yourself into is record locking, which is tricky to deal with. But basically, what you want to do your best to do is with these asynchronous processes, make sure that your synchronous Apex is not updating the exact same records that your asynchronous processing is as well. Sometimes that can be very tricky depending on what you're doing, but you do need to think about that. When I'm running my synchronous code and then I'm spawning these asynchronous jobs, am I getting myself into a record locking scenario? And that can be, you can have record locking on related records or parent records too. So you have to think about all those things when you're doing, asynchronous processing. It's very important, and it's super important for scheduled and especially batch jobs, because you can get yourself into a situation in a batch job where you get into some pretty significant record locking and everything just starts to break down. So you really have to sit down and think about the records that you're updating and make sure that you're not updating the same things, at the same moment in time, or there's even, a possibility of that happening. Ideally, you get yourself out of that. You don't have to get in the record locking stuff. I've been there many times. It's not an easy thing to eliminate entirely, but you can do it. You just have to really think about it. Okay, record locking. Ooh, went over that. Let's move on to scheduled Apex, and then last but not least, we'll get into Batchable, and then we'll talk about briefly push topics, change events, and platform events. So let's get over to the scheduled jobs. All right, so let's create a new class so that we can build a schedulable class together. So we'll just call this schedulable Apex or something. I don't know. And then I'm going to zoom in a bunch so that you guys can see, at least a little easier anyway. And the first thing we're going to do is, just like when we built the Queueable class, we're going to implement an interface. We're going to say implements the schedulable interface. And just like with the Queueables, it's going to complain because we have yet to implement our methods. So we'll implement the execute method. And this method is what's going to execute as soon as your schedulable Apex gets called, each time that it gets called. So if you're scheduling your Apex to run every hour or every day or once a year, this is what's going to execute every single time it runs. Now, just like with the Queueable, what if you wanted to pass something into your schedulable Apex? This is a great question, but it's got the same answer. You just need a constructor. You'd say public schedulable Apex, and then you pass in whatever parameters that you wanted to get it going. And also, just like the Queueable interface or Queueable Apex, if you want to do callouts in a schedulable Apex class, you would also implement the database.allows callouts. If you don't, you're going to get an error. You're going to be sad. If you Google this question, you don't get great responses. If I'm being honest, you're going to get a whole lot of wrong responses. So there you go. You need to make a call out. Definitely just do this and you'll be able to. You go on the internet, people say call a future method or whatever else. You certainly could. You call future, you call batch, but you can do it here too. All right, so now, like we've stated before, the reason that you would typically use a scheduled class is because you want to schedule some Apex to run at a certain point in the day, you know, every day or every week or every month, right? That's its specific use case. That's very unique with it. You will often see schedulable Apex linked with batch Apex, right? And I've seen people do this in a bunch of different ways. So you've got your schedulable Apex, right, that we've got right here, that I'll show you how to invoke here in just a second. Then you've got your batch job that you run from your schedulable Apex class. And we'll go over that in just a little bit, in just a second. But one thing I do want to say is I would never try to merge those two into the same class. Don't try and make your schedulable Apex also a batchable one. And I say that because I've seen it several times, and it causes unintended consequences, mostly because the way that the execute method works for schedulable is very different than the way it works for batchable executions. And people think that this is going to run a lot more often than it actually does for a schedulable context. So just I always break them up. It's easier to maintain. It's easier to know which one is in charge of what. And that way you're not kind of merging things and getting things a little bit confused. All right. Okay. So we've got our schedulable Apex. It's not really doing much of anything right now. But let's just have it execute something, right? Let's just do something similar where we say, let's say list of contacts. Actually, you know what? Let's make this even easier so we can demonstrate the same kind of thing. We'll get a list of contacts. Cont list equals new, or actually, I'm just going to leave it at that. And then we'll pass in a list of contacts. Got this cough that just won't quit. And then we'll say this dot cont list equals cont list. If this is confusing, this refers to your class. So this class's cont list variable is equal to the one that you passed in. And then down here we'll say for contact cont list dot first name equals Jambet. Last name scheduler. And then we will update the cont list. Cool. So we've got this schedulable Apex class. We've got something going on with it that we're going to basically update all of our contacts to have the first name and last name of Jambet scheduler. Quality name. Let's go on ahead and save this. I don't need callouts, so I'm just going to drop that bad boy real quick. And then we'll see how to actually get this running, because there are two ways to schedule Apex classes. You can either schedule it via code, or you can schedule it via the Salesforce setup. So that's slowly but surely saving down here in the corner. I'm not sure if you guys can see that, but it is blazingly slow. I like to call it lightning slow. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. Okay, so let's bring that over here, and I'll just show you really quick in the schedule, in the interface, how you'd schedule the job. Actually, I believe it's in, well, I haven't done this in a bit. I can't remember whether it's in scheduled jobs. I don't think it is. I think it's in Apex classes. Yeah. So in Apex classes, you can do schedule Apex right here. There's a little button. Then I can name my job whatever I want, and I will, pick my scheduled Apex class because it's the only one. And then I could say, I want this to run weekly or monthly, every Saturday or Friday or whatever else, and I can do a start and an end date and a preferred start time and all that kind of stuff, right? So I can do all of this via configuration, which is great, but you can see that it is a little bit limiting in that it won't let you do this every hour or every minute. I actually have a video that goes over how to do something like that because it's a little bit more complicated if you want to do it right. So, yeah, just so you know, you can do all of that here. And I'll link the video to the one that shows you how to schedule it every hour. But there is also a way to do this through the code. And before we get into scheduling this Apex job in the code, I want to make you aware of several very important, just maybe a couple of very important things. The first is that you can only have 100 scheduled Apex jobs at a time. So if you have more than that are going, you'll be in a lot of trouble. You will have scheduled Apex that fails to schedule itself, all that kind of stuff. And you don't want to be in that situation. So before you start scheduling classes in your code, make sure that that's really well defined when it should be scheduled and it's not happening too often. So for instance, if you put some code in a trigger to schedule a class like this, make sure that that's locked down really well and it's not happening very often, because if you start scheduling classes in a trigger, you could get yourself into a difficult situation that you won't like and the people in your org won't like. So be very aware of the limits here because it is important. Yeah. Also, if a job is scheduled, like this job, and it's calling another Apex class within it, you won't be able to update that Apex class that it calls. So say, for instance, right here in the execute, I said synchronous Apex, the other class we were just working on. Apex equals new synchronous Apex. There we go. And then just because this is referenced here, as long as this scheduled class is scheduled, then you will not be able to update and change this class. With one exception, which is you can deploy it new from like a change set deployment or metadata API deployment. Okay. All right. So let's figure out how we actually invoke this schedulable Apex class from our code, right? So let's go back over here to Synchronous Apex. And now I'm just going to get rid of these other calls in here because it's starting to bug me having commented code. And I'm going to actually schedule this schedulable Apex class from within my Synchronous Apex. So to schedule your job, basically all you're going to do is initialize your class. And we're going to say schedulable Apex, schedule, schedule. I'm just going to make it schedule equals new schedulable Apex. And if you remember, I do require a list of contacts to be passed in. So I'm going to pass in my list of contacts that I've created here. And then what I'm going to do is create what's called a cron string, right? Basically what this string does is it's going to tell Salesforce or your server how often you want this schedule class to run. And it's very confusing when you see it, but I'll go over this cron string. So we're going to do 0, 0, and I don't know what time it is for me. 3 o'clock, so that's 15. This is minutes, so I'm going to do 25. Oh, I'm going to cough here. See if I can fend it off. And then I'll do star, star, question mark. And yeah, so what this means is on 0 seconds, 25th minute of the 15th hour, so 3 o'clock, 3:25, on every day of the week, on every month, and then I'm not declaring a year, so I'm giving it this question mark. I want this schedule class to run. And then I'm going to say system.schedule, and I'm going to give it a name, right? So I'll call this schedule job demo. And then we'll give it the cron. And then we'll give it the schedule class. I think that's the right order. Okay, it is. So basically, we're going to schedule this class. It's got this schedule job demo name, so we'll be able to find it in the scheduled Apex class, which I'll show you in just a second. And then we're passing it the time at which we would like it to run. And then I'm passing it the class that we want to actually run. Now, real quick, it's just occurred to me, mostly because I just failed, and then I cut this video because I was very confused, that, I'm scheduling this for my local time, which is 3:23. Now it's 3:28. But my org is actually on West Coast time zone. So if I schedule this right now, I'm going to have to wait 2 hours, which wouldn't be great. So instead, I'm going to change this to my org's time zone, which is the West Coast. And I'm going to update this number since, I failed for a while there. And I'm going to save this. I'm going to update this to 30 because I think I'm running out of time. I'm going to save this. And once it deploys, then I'm going to run this again. And hopefully it will schedule for a time close instead of far, far away. So we're going to run this and bring up our scheduled jobs. I'm going to refresh this. So you can get to scheduled jobs in setup. If you didn't know, just type scheduled jobs in the Finder here. And now you can see at 1:28 I submitted the job and it's supposed to run at 1:30. And if we hopefully get to our contacts before 1:30, if I'm smart enough, which might not be the case, then we can see, hopefully, that these names have not been updated yet, right? So far, nothing's been updated. Their emails have likely been updated, but not them. So Future Chocolate got updated, which is what we care about. The Jig Pig guy, he's not running anytime soon. So let's see, it is almost 3:30 or 1:30 org time. And let's just go back to our scheduled jobs. I'm sure it'll run here in just a second. Should have just run. So you can see that it started at 1:30, which is great. And if we go into Future Chocolate, oh, we can see it actually did it before we even clicked on it. It changed to Jambet Scheduler. So pretty cool. And you can see it scheduled its next run for tomorrow at 1:30, the same time. Again, if you want more information on how to set up some more advanced scheduled jobs, the very first video I ever made on this channel is about that. So definitely go check it out. All right, scheduled jobs. Checked off the list. Now you know when to use them, why to use them, all that kind of good stuff. Let's get in to batchables. Batchables. There's a lot to talk about. Oftentimes you'll use Synchronous Apex with batchables. Not Synchronous Apex, sorry. Schedulable Apex with batchables. You'll schedule something to have a batchable run because you're doing an enormous amount of work on an enormous amount of data. And that's exactly what batchables are great at, doing enormous amounts of work on enormous amounts of data. Let's check it out, right? So we're going to create yet another Apex class. And we'll call it Batchable Apex. And I'm going to zoom. And then we're going to say implements batchable. And it's again going to complain because we don't have the batchable methods in here. And you can see there's several methods for batchable here. So we're going to hit OK. Oh, I just added the one. Let's add all of them. And there we go. So I don't like the way that this ordered these, so I'm going to reorder them a little bit. So for our Batchable class, we've got a start method, an execute method, and a finish method. And just like with Queueables and with Schedulable Apex, if you want to do callouts, you need to add the callouts. Well, it's not going to autocomplete for me. Database dot allows callouts. Right? You need to do that to be able to, do any call out to an external system. So just don't forget that. Super important to remember that thing. Otherwise, you do get yourself into tricky situations that don't have the best Google search results, if I'm being totally honest. So in this start method, this is where you're going to typically do your querying, right? You're going to basically provide one of two things for your, I guess I shouldn't say querying. This is where you're going to provide the data for your execute method to deal with, right? So this is a little confusing. Trying to think of the best way to say this. Say you called this Batchable Apex class, which we'll see how to do that in just a little bit, and you sent you needed to have it iterate through 60,000 records or something, right? Well, in here you would define what those 60,000 records are, and then in the execute, in whatever batch size you've told this batch job to use, it will execute as many times as necessary to get through all 60,000 records, right? So if you have a batch size of 200, then you'd have 60,000 divided by 200, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm going to figure that out in my head. So that's what you'd end up with. So 60,000 divided by 200. Let's see what the calculator says. 60,000 divided by 200. You'd end up having this execute method called 300 times in your batch class, right? So pretty important thing to know. This preps your data. This actually runs your batches on that data, that execute method, and then once all of the batches are done, then this finish method gets called, so that you can do error logs, potentially schedule or run yet another batch job, or whatever else you want to do. So let's take a look at this. You have two options here in the start. You can do a custom iterable, which I am not going to get into here because this is already a long video and this would make it even longer. Or you can do query locators. So what I'm going to use is a database.query locator. And honestly, most of the time, except for in relatively rare situations, you're going to want to use the database query locator. And that's because this allows you to query for millions of records, which again, like I said before, Batchable Apex is best served when you have tons and tons of data to go through and to update. It doesn't have to be millions of records, but you can see, you're not going to hit a limit anytime soon with the query locator, right? So let's figure out how to make this work. Just like with the last two, I'm going to create a constructor. So we'll call it Batchable Apex, and we're going to pass in a list of contacts again. And we are going to have a list of contact, cont list, and not set it equal to anything. But in here, we'll say this dot cont list is equal to cont list, semicolon, name the variable, good to go. And what we'll end up doing, actually, I'd rather do this a different way. Let me see. Actually, I want to send in, I'd rather send in a string. So I'm going to send in a string query, and I'm going to call this one string query 2. Got into the habit of doing the same thing, and that's not actually what we want to do here. and we want to set this class's query string equal to the query that we pass in. And then we are going to, down here, where the database query locator is in the, or where we will define the database query locator in the start method, we'll say return database dot query locator, and we will pass it that string query, just like that. It's get query locator though. There we go. So basically what we're doing is we're going to pass in a string, so some dynamic Apex, or dynamic querying, I suppose, going on. We're going to pass that to our query locator to allow it to query for that data and return us results. And then in the execute method, we are going to get a list of results. In our case, it's going to be contacts. So we'll call this cont list. And then we can, do whatever we want to with those contacts. We'll say contact cont list. And let's just update every contact's first name to be equal to Batchable. Whoa, something. It's coughing. It just wants to get me. So here we go. And then we're going to do update cont list, and that'll do it. Keeping it nice and simple while still going over some of the important things to note here. Now, one additional thing to note about Batchable Apex is that in the finish method, you can reschedule batch Apex, or reschedule. You can do yet another batch job, but you can only do up to 3. So you can only chain up to 3 in finish statements before you reach your limits there. Still, you can do quite a bit with that. So if you need more than 3, you probably need to go another route. Normally, I almost always put emails in these finish methods that get sent to admins, or I log this information just so I know that this completed appropriately and nothing crazy happened. So real quick, before we move on, I need to add the type up here to the database.batchable implementation. Otherwise, it's going to get really frustrated at me and tell me I need to use an iterable and that I haven't declared a type and all that kind of stuff. So let's just make sure to add that there. Someday I will make a video on iterables, but not today. It deserves its own video for sure. Let's come over here to the Synchronous Apex class, delete all of this stuff for schedulable stuff. Let me mute my phone because it just won't stop. And then I'm going to run some code that will actually execute that batch job. So we'll say database execute batch. And then in here, we're going to say new Batchable Apex. And you have an optional second parameter that tells you how, it gives you the ability to define the size of your batches in your batch job. So by default, if you don't do this, each batch is up to 200 records. But just to show you how this works with the few records I have in my system, I'm going to make it a size of 1. You really typically should not have a batch of size 1 unless you have a really good reason for it. It should be 200 or greater, or at least like 50 or something. But you might have a unique situation, so I don't know. And then the next thing we need to do is, if you remember, in the Batchable Apex, we pass in a query string. So we need to define that query string over here, and we'll say string query equals, and it's basically just going to be this whole bad boy here. But I want to get every single contact in the system this time to update them. And that ought to do it, I think. So we saved it. We're good to go. And the next thing that we need to do is actually run this and see this batch job work. So what is the batch job doing again? Basically, it's going to iterate one at a time through my contacts. and set their first names to Batchable. So let's go back over here. We'll bring up the contacts, right? I'll bring up all my contacts. And I think there's quite a few in here, some with more appropriate names than others. And gosh, and I'm going to run this code again through Anonymous Apex and see what happens. Oh, one other thing I want to bring up is our Apex jobs page so that you can see how to take a look at these. All right, so we're going to run this. And it ran successfully, thankfully. And if I refresh this, we can see that we have batch Apex that had 16 total batches because I have 16 total contacts. And since I declared a batch size of 1 right here, we have, 16 batches, if that makes sense. So this execute, just to be super clear here, this execute method ran 16 times because we had a batch size of 1 and we sent into our query locator here, our start method, 16 records to work with. Okay, now let's refresh this page and see if their first names all got updated. And they did. They're all batchable, right? So Batchable Berry, I kind of like that one. Batchable Boy. Whoa. Okay, so yeah, I think that about covers it for the code examples, how to get this stuff done, how to actually use it, all that kind of stuff. Last but not least, we will talk about platform events, push topics, and change data capture events. So let's check those bad boys out. All right, so the first of these 3 that we'll go over are push topics. Push topics are part of the streaming API. Which I feel like is very rarely used in Salesforce, at least unless you're getting into some of the bigger instances that need more integrations with external systems. But the one thing that's unique about streaming APIs, and just so you guys know, I'm going to just give a very brief idea of why you might use one of these over the other, because they are asynchronous and they do fall in here, but they each are so big that they need their own video for me to explain them a lot. But let me give you an idea of why you might pick one over the other so that you have that information if you ever need it in the future. Push topics are basically best used when you want to pre-filter data for some external system to subscribe to, right? So basically what a push topic will do, you can create a new push topic record in Salesforce. It'll let you tell it'll let you specify whether you want to notify on that push topic, whether notify that other system or send out a message basically when something was created on an object or deleted or undeleted or updated. And unlike change data capture, which we'll see here in just a minute, it allows you to create filters through the use of queries, albeit queries with tons and tons of limits on them, to basically be able to, filter that data prior to sending it out and pushing those topics to the other systems that are subscribed to that topic notification. So, yeah, biggest use case for this, if you ever decide to use it, is you can pre-filter data. And yeah. So you ever need a system to know about the different events that are happening on your different objects and you want to pre-filter that data, push topics are one of the better choices to consider. Change data capture over here, which I am on a weird page, I guess, is basically a way for another system to subscribe to changes for your objects as well, right? So you can synchronize the system like it says here, or you can reconcile duplicate data between the systems. Lots of other things you could potentially do with this, but basically in Salesforce, unlike push topics, you have a really nice, very simple UI for change data capture. You can go in here, basically click here, and then set up, add it over here to basically just say, all right, I want to start capturing change events on this object. And once you do, you can then have other systems subscribe to those change events for those different objects that you add here. But unlike push topics, you don't have the ability to filter, pre-filter anyway. You could obviously filter on whatever, whatever was subscribed to it. They could just take the data and filter it themselves. But yeah, that is why you would consider it. And last but not least, we've got the platform events. Where did they go? Oh, maybe here they are. Platform events, which is basically a way to send custom notifications out. So you have the ability with platform events to basically define custom data from an event on an object and then send it out. So say, for instance, maybe in your contact trigger when certain things happened, you wanted to send out an event with maybe even more than the contact data or some kind of predetermined data out to another system. Well, you can use platform events for that, and they're pretty excellent at what they do. I mean, this is, in my opinion, the one that you will likely use the most, platform events, out of the other all three of those options. And that's mostly because they're pretty scalable. You can pretty much do whatever. There's plenty of limitations to this too, but you can pretty much do whatever you can think of with platform events. There's a lot that I've done, and there's I think Jitendra Zah has put out a great article, and there was something on Salesforce Way, the podcast, where he goes over some incredible things he's done with platform events. But you can really do quite a bit with platform events. One of the great things about platform events, and really all of these great things, and maybe not so great things, depending on what you're doing, is that these will operate as system administrators. So when these events publish themselves, you in Salesforce can actually make triggers for each of these different types of things: push topics, platform events, and change data capture events. And if you do, and you try to catch those events in your own org, there are some interesting things you can do with it to both expand the limits of your org quite a bit and to potentially run things that you couldn't for a regular user as an administrator in the background. So obviously they wouldn't run in real time, but you could potentially say, for instance, there's a handful of things, permissions, I would say, that typically you can only really give administrators, but maybe in really, really unique, odd situations, you need to give those to non-administrators. Sometimes you can leverage platform events or CDC, or I would typically use platform events, if I'll be honest, to do those kind of things. So as far as why you would use one over the other, platform events are basically completely custom events that you define, and you define the data that's sent in them for the most part. So if you want a custom one, then go that route. Change data capture is the simplest one. You basically just set it up for your object, and it's going to send out information about that object. There's not a lot to it. You can subscribe to it and get all the information you want to keep everything in sync and going well. And then the push topic one, if you want to kind of pre-filter your data, then you might use that over change data capture to make your life just a little bit easier. Now, are there plenty of other reasons maybe that I haven't run into where one of these is better than another? Absolutely, but that's just a brief overview real quick of why you might consider one of these over the other, as they are, at least in my experience, the other three big asynchronous things that you can do in Salesforce and in Apex through the use of whew, caught up to me finally, through the use of asynchronous triggers on each one of those things, push topics, change data capture events, and platform events. So pretty cool stuff. And I think that ought to do it, guys. I don't know how long this video is, but it feels like pretty long. So hopefully this was very useful. Hopefully it gives you a lot of information about Asynchronous Apex and the many options that you have, when to use them, why to use them, when not to use them, the little quirks about them. Oh, there's plenty more quirks I know I didn't cover. So anyway, if you like this video, make sure to subscribe. Hit the like button, definitely, because it helps me out a ton. And if you subscribe and you share these videos, don't forget, you will be entered in every month for an opportunity to win one of 2 free certs and a free hour of my consulting time, if you want it, and a free month in the Discord chat. So where you can talk to me every day for up to a month and get, you know, all the information, at least I think maybe I can help with. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you all next time.